By becoming a materialist, you are entering a marriage, believe it or not. By entering the marriage of materialism, as with any marriage, you are getting much more than you thought you were getting. Much more than the bride of materialism. You've inherited more than the belief in a physical reality. You've married into a whole new family of ideas. You're going to have to find some way to fit them all together. And you may want to believe all of these ideas, or you may find them kind of troublesome, like those in-laws that you don't really like, but you have to sort of, deal with them. The first of these ideas is the idea that the beginning of physical reality was mechanistic, or that the beginning causes, at least, were mechanistic. By mechanistic, I mean that the basic causes of life, of the universe, of physical reality, proceeded without regards to goals, had no purpose to fulfill. The basic process proceeded without regard for intentions. This is the materialist's genesis. The beginning was free of purpose, free of subjective viewpoints, of consciousness, and therefore of rationality. It's not something you can prove, and this is not something you can disprove either. It's just entailed by marrying materialism. The second basic idea is that of the causal closure of physics. This means, and I'm quoting Jae Kim, that any physical event that has a cause at time t has a physical cause at time t. So if there's a physical effect at time t, it had a physical cause. Note that, though, that this doesn't mean that if there was a physical cause at time t, its effect must have been physical. There could be a physical cause of a non-physical effect. But this leads us to our third basic idea, that whatever non-physical things exist are created by the physical and wholly dependent upon the physical for their existence. Now here, I'll take a 1-minute sort of interlude from this argument, just to remind you of 2 points, or to remind you of 1 point and add an additional point. If Robert wholly determines the formation of John's beliefs, then the rationality of John severely depends on the rationality of Robert. So in a purely deterministic setting, the rationality of the effect depends on the rationality of its cause. I went further than this in my last video. I suggested that there is no real rationality in this situation apart from the rationality of Robert. It doesn't make sense to say that an abacus or that a computer is being rational or irrational or stupid. It does make sense to say that the programmer or determiner is being rational or irrational. But if this doesn't move you, I'll be happy to just maintain that the rationality of the effect depends severely on the rationality of the cause. Also, let's specify the type of belief, the rationality of which we are discussing. John Locke was this big philosopher, and you're probably more familiar with him than I am, even. And despite what I think to be his really hard-headed empiricism, argued that there are 2 different sources of our knowledge, and there may be more, but it doesn't so much matter whether he was technically correct here. And he broke it down to 2 sources of knowledge, one through direct sensory observations, which he described as looking outward, and the other through deliberation, through introspection and reflection, which he described as looking inward. So let's think about a belief of that second sort, the sort that requires reasoning and interpreting data using logical laws, the sort of belief that required mediating between varying options. So my question would be whether a belief of that sort can ever occur rationally and deterministically. So back to this process that happened in the beginning, right? This physical process proceeded without regard for goals or intentions, and that process was airtight. There was no rationality injected into the system from above. And given the causal closure of physics, at each point of this process, each effect is caused by the prior physical cause. Now, if Robert were irrational or non-rational, and he determined John's behavior to conform to Robert's liking, then we'd both agree that John's behavior would also be irrational. Similarly, if the prior physical cause is non-rational, its effect is non-rational, in general, in abstract. But if at the beginning of this process the causes were all non-rational, nothing rational could ever occur, since all effects that proceed from this basic cause were wholly and sufficiently caused without regard for reasons or purposes or goals. Each physical effect was sufficiently caused by virtue of physical properties of mass and size and velocity, or of gravity, and different forces that act on it without regard for goals or purposes. So a belief occurs and in turn causes other beliefs to occur by virtue of these properties, these physical properties, and not by virtue of its logical properties like its truth value or its intentionality. Since, as I have argued in my other video response to you, that these properties are not identical to each other. So now you know why I made that video at all. So firstly, if this is the case, why does it matter? Well, firstly, if this is the case, we never behave rationally. For our behavior is the result of prior causes that were, number one, non-rational, and number two, sufficient for our behavior. So our behavior is the inevitable result of non-rational causes. Secondly, our beliefs would not occur by virtue of their being true or being guided by rational insight, but rather, given materialism, by virtue of their physical properties, which proceeded without regard for the things that they were making were true or not. That's the basic idea of the argument from rationality. And this is why rationality presupposes free will. It presupposes the idea that not all our beliefs are sufficiently caused by virtue of their physical properties. It's a really old argument. It's as old as Plato. After Plato, I think the biggest arguer who made this argument was Kant, Immanuel Kant. And I think Christian and pagan philosophers were really unified in making this one argument. G.K. Chesterton, centuries later, made the same argument in his book Orthodoxy, which is a really masterful, really nice, cool book. And that was published in the 1800s, I think, the late 1800s. And around the same time, as I was researching this argument, I came across an online copy of Arthur Balfour's book, A Defense of Philosophic Doubt, which makes this similar argument, which is essentially the same as I've made it now. And in the 20th century, you have people like Norman Malcolm, like C.S. Lewis, and most recently, among the guys who are still alive today, are John Searle and Tom Nagel. The thing that's interesting about the contemporary philosophers who've been making this argument is that they're not all Christian, they're not all theists, they're not even all dualists. But John Searle, for example, really believes that this is one of the biggest problems for naturalists. And so, unlike other arguments, I think the strength of this argument is that over the centuries, it's actually been refined by the progress of science. People accuse it of being a sort of non-physical mind of the gaps type of thing, when in fact, it's actually become more prominent. It's become a more obviously perceived argument, and its validity hasn't been diminished by the progress of science. So, I think it's a good argument. If you don't, let me know why. I might make a video response listing the objections to this argument, which have actually remained unchanged for the past couple centuries. And they're reasonable objections, and I don't really think they work, but let me know what you think. Alright, peace.